Good afternoon to everybody. I hope you can hear me. Everyone is muted, but I'm assuming you can hear me. I think we can start with an introduction. First of all, welcome Avishai. I will present Professor Avishai Henik, who will give the next talk. My name is Gurion from the ISCOP committee. So Avishai Henik is a distinguished professor emeritus of psychology at the Gurion University of the Negev. He conducted his PhD work in the Hebrew University under the supervision of Daniel Kahneman, and conducted his postdoctoral research in Eugene, Oregon, under the supervision of Michael Posner, two very famous researchers, as you all know. Since his appointment at the Ben-Gurion University, he has been studying many areas that form the building blocks of cognitive psychology, such as attention and cognitive control, as well as emotion self-regulation, numerical cognition, and synesthesia. Avishai has over 300 publications. He was awarded the prestigious ERC Advanced Grant to continue his cutting-edge research on the contribution of non-countable dimensions to the development and understanding of numerical cognition. In addition, Avishai recently won a Humboldt Research Award in recognition of accomplishments in research and teaching, and the Fens Kavli Network of Excellence Mentoring Prize for demonstrated leadership in fostering the careers of psychologists and neuroscientists. Lastly, and most relevant to the present forum, Avishai was instrumental in launching the ACO ISCOP conferences. He was involved in launching the monthly newsletter that we all receive, and in initiating the Israel Cognitive Psychology annual meeting held at least on normal years in ACO, and this year virtually. And if you recognize my background, if you've been to ACO, then you know that I'm actually broadcasting from ACO. No, not really. So without further ado, I would like to invite Avishai to talk about cognitive control processes and implications. And thank you for all joining us today. Avishai, the stage is yours.
Okay, so thanks, Nurit.
I'll just mention that regarding questions, if you can all mute yourself during the talk, and at the end of the talk, we'll allow you to raise your hand using the reactions, and I'll let you ask anything you want. So Avishai, please go ahead.
Yes. Okay, so Nurit, thanks a lot for the introduction, and thank the committee for inviting me. I'm going to talk about cognitive processes and implications. The plan of my talk. I'm going to talk a little bit about loss of control, the environmental dependency syndrome, a syndrome that Lermit talked about quite a few years ago. Then I'm going to talk about paradigmatic task of cognitive control, the Stroop task, its components, interference and facilitation, task conflict, and additional conflict that was started to be discussed about 20 years ago, and then some implications and conclusions. Okay, so let's start. This is from a paper by Lermit, the environmental dependency syndrome. And Lermit presents in this paper two patients that have a huge strokes, frontal strokes. One is a patient number one is an engineer, 51 years old. The other one is 52 years old female housewife. As he presented her, this is the paper, the title. And this is what's going on. He said that, I'm going to give you the description of the female, the woman. And he said that they were, Lermit is a neurologist, and they were sitting in his office, and she was sitting in front of him, and she immediately picked up several instruments on the table, kind of medical instruments. And when he asked her what she thought, she started looking at him and using the blood pressure gauge and other instruments on him. And then he asked her what she thought. She said that she's very satisfied with his health. You can see here in this two pictures. Here's the blood pressure. This is where the tongue depressor, she uses the tongue depressor to look at his mouth. And basically what happens here, and the same with the engineer, is that control was shifted to the environment. This is kind of an exaggerated dependence on external cues for control of behavior. We can summarize this by saying that the patient's behavior was controlled by external stimuli, the blood pressure gauge, for example, rather than by her or his internal goals or intentions. There was a switch from a patient task behavior to a physician task behavior, kind of the schema changed. And the last thing is that the medical equipment set up the framework for the schema or the model of a physician treating a patient. Needless to say, this is a very extreme syndrome, two very extreme cases that we don't see in daily life, but they kind of set up the stage for what I want to say. One of the paradigmatic tasks that we are all familiar with and has been used for many, many years is the Stroop task. And the Stroop task is considered to be a task that examines control, selective attention, cognitive control. This is the Stroop task basically. You are presented with a word in color and asked to say what the color is and ignore the word. In this case, we have so this would be a congruent condition in which the word is and the color match. This is a neutral condition. We can discuss various neutral conditions, but a series of X's in yellow is a neutral condition in this case, and the incongruent, the stimulus that I actually presented before, the word blue in yellow. And if you try to do it, if you didn't do it before, it is always the case that it is harder to say yellow to the word blue than to the word yellow. And Stroop is, now that we are talking about replication in psychology, Stroop is one of those tests or tasks in which you replicate your results every time. There are differences and so on, but if you ran a Stroop task and you didn't get the interference effect, you know that something was wrong in programming or in what you did and so on. So these are the typical results. And all my slides, almost all my slides will be similar. So you have reaction time here, the various conditions here. This is the incongruent, red, the word red in yellow, and the difference between the incongruent and the neutral, the XXX in yellow, is considered to be the interference. Then you can look at the difference between the neutral and the congruent condition. This is the facilitation. And what I present here is actually what we usually get. The interference is big, very big, and the facilitation is small. Now, the Stroop task is called or named after the person who suggested it in an experiment in 1935. And you have to remember, and I'm going to relate to it later, that actually these two conditions are the conditions that Stroop himself used in his paper in 1935. This is because simply because he couldn't use congruent condition. Because how did Stoop ran the task? Basically, what happened was that he put words on a card and ask people to name the colors and ignore the words. So if you have words like red and yellow, that's not a problem. If you have series of X's, he had patches of color. This is also okay. If you have congruent condition, then you actually can't tell. If you have 100 words and the person is starting to say what the color is and ignore the word, she can switch to reading in the middle, and the experimenter wouldn't be able to know that actually these are all mistakes because this is the congruent condition. It is only when computers were introduced to or tachistoscopes to labs in psychology that we could use single trial presentations, and then we could also have the congruent condition mixed with the incongruent and neutral. Okay, so one of the effects with the Stroop, as I said, I mean, there are lots of Stroop papers, but I'm not going to mention all of them, but just a few that are relevant to what I'm going to talk about. So one effect, very prominent effect and actually highly cited, and I can tell you already, apparently there's a problem with this effect, is what we call the Klein effect. Now, what did Klein do? This is a paper from '64, and he ran the Stroop task. The only thing that he did, in addition to the incongruent words and the neutral words, and the neutral trials, was that he had various other incongruent words, like words that are related to color, like blood for red, or words that have no connection, no association to color at all, and non-words or pronounceable non-words, non-pronounceable non-words, and so on. And when he looked at the results, he reported that he found that the interference, the difference between the incongruent condition and the neutral were different for the various conditions. The words that were associated with color, like blood, interfered less than the incongruent color word, but more than the other non-associated and less frequent word, and of course more than the pseudo words and so on. And this effect has been, people related to it as the Klein effect, which is a declining gradient of interference. And the interpretation is that the competition between the individual response codes associated with the stimulus, that is, there are two possible response codes, and this creates the interference. And because words that color words are associated more with colors, they are immediately activated. They activate the lexical codes. Words that are related to color, like blood, also activate color, but to a lesser degree, and so on and so forth. You can understand why we are talking about a declining gradient of interference. This is, of course, very nice and makes sense even. However, there are several attempts of replication that didn't work. One of them, or the major attempt, was by Steve Monsell and colleagues. Steve talks about task set. What he did was that he tried to actually just replicate this Klein effect, or the gradient of interference, and use very similar in a sense, very similar stimuli, like line. One of the differences, there were several differences. One difference was that the participant saw each example only once. So if there was the word blood, it appeared only once in the experiment. There was no repetition like in Klein's experiment. The other thing was that participants were asked to name the words rather than respond by key presses like we do many times, and so on. So it was a very an attempt to replicate, but there were several measures, several precautions that Monsell took. And the results of experiment one appear here. As you can see, there's the bottom line is that there's no replication. There's no Klein effect. That is, you can see that this is the pseudo words, okay? And the high frequency, medium frequency word, low frequency word were similar to the pseudo word. And actually the pseudo word created a little bit more interference than the others. And if anything, the high frequency word created less interference than the medium frequency, the low frequency, and so on, which is really contrary to what one would expect if one believes in, or one take Klein's effect or the gradient, the gradient of interference as a must or something that has to appear. It led, now I have to say that actually in this paper by Monsell and colleagues, there are 3 experiments. I'm just giving you the very first experiment, the results of the first experiment, but the results are the same. So what, So what Monsell summarized was that apparently there's something else going on. And actually it's not there's no interference gradient, but rather there's a 2 sets or 2 tasks that compete with one another. One task is the reading, which you see a word, you automatically try to read it. Another one is the experimental task, the naming the color. And these 2 compete for the person's attention, and this is how the interference appears. Now, please note that here, and of course, also in Klein's paper, there was no congruent condition. Okay, so both Klein and Monsell talked about the interference component. There's no facilitation here. They didn't look for facilitation and nothing like that. Now, this is just, I'm not going to talk about neuroscience a lot, but just this is important because it's part of our story, is that there are certain areas that have been found to be connected or involved in the Stroop effect. And these are mainly the anterior cingulate and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, okay? So these are 2 areas. I'm not going to go into detail, just to mention this. So now, if you look at the ACC, the anterior cingulate, you see that incongruent trials create larger activation than neutral trials. It was suggested that this activation is due to the fact that the anterior cingulate trace conflicts. And accordingly, we expect smaller activation for congruent than for neutral trials because of the facilitation. But this doesn't happen. quite a few researchers reported that there was larger activation for congruent than for neutral trials. Okay, these are the papers. So we have some kind of a contradiction. In behavior, we find facilitation or very small facilitation. And in the ACC or neuroscience or neuroimaging, we find reverse facilitation, that is congruent, larger activation than neutral. Liat Goldfarb took upon herself to the task to try and see if she can do something with this behaviorally, whether she can create this kind of reverse facilitation with behavior, something that usually people do not get. And so in order to do this, she used something that Yossi Tselgov and I did a few years ago, and this is to manipulate control. So before I'm going to present to you Liat's work, I need to present something about how we thought that we can manipulate control. So what we did was to, again, a stoop task, but we changed the proportion of neutral trials. That is, the number of congruent and incongruent trials were exactly the same, but the proportion of neutral trials was changed. Now, when we had 25% neutrals, we get the regular result. There's a small facilitation and large interference. Sorry. In the 75% neutrals, in contrast, you do not get facilitation at all. And actually, you get a little bit of reverse facilitation at the time. I can tell you the story. We didn't have a good explanation why this happens, and this was it. Okay, so Liat used a very similar arrangement, but she thought that she needs to really make even to work on the changing the control even more. So what she did was to have 75% neutrals and 50% queuing. The queuing was that X meant that there's a color word, and O meant that there's a letter series, neutral, and question mark, any stimulus can appear. So actually, this is only 5% of the cases, and Liat thought that this will create a case in which the subject will be really lenient and not very try not to control actually what's going on, and or the and this will reveal the what she thought was the task set, Monsell's task set or our task conflict, and these are the results. So, so these are the queued 75%, and you can see that you get a little bit of a reverse facilitation. But for the not queued, these guys with the question mark as a prime, you get a pretty big reverse facilitation. And this reverse facilitation became for us to be a measure of task conflict, meaning that what's going on is that we have two conflicts here. One is the information conflict. You have to respond red or respond blue. There are two informations that that are incongruent, and this appears in the incongruent trials. And in addition to that, there are two tasks, and you have to just pay attention to or execute only one task, naming the color, and ignore the word. So this is the task conflict. And the task conflict appears not only in incongruent trials, but also in congruent trials. Now, in congruent trials, the interesting thing is that you get the information is exactly the same. The color and the word give you exactly the same information, but the task is still, there are two tasks to be executed, and you need to really pay attention to one, to naming the color and ignore the words. There were several examples for this, but I think I'm running out of time. So Vido Lahey did something. I'm going to skip this. Let me move to stopping and the stop effect. So we are familiar with the conditions or the context of trying to stop when you actually prepare to respond, or you and one of the good examples is that you are ready to start moving with the car, and then you see that something happened and you have to stop immediately. This is basically what drive the or led Gordon Logan to create his stop signal task. And the stop signal task goes like this. You are asked to press a key, for example, the right-hand key for red, the left-hand key for green, and then sometimes there's a tone. The tone can appear right after the stimulus, and of course, it is easy to stop if the stop signal, the tone, appeared right with the stimulus, in parallel with the stimulus. If it appears a little bit after the stimulus, it is a little bit harder to stop. And as we take the tone and move it away from the stimulus, that is, for example, 200 milliseconds, 300 milliseconds after the onset of the stimulus, it is pretty hard to stop. And Gordon suggested to measure the stop signal reaction time by looking at the location in time where people really, on half of the times, are able to stop, and half of the time they are unable to stop. And there's a way to measure SSRT. And we thought that actually, now this way of experimenting, of looking for a threshold point, give you lots of cases, so lots of trials in which people were trying to stop and just inadvertently didn't stop. So there are cases that are around the threshold, around the SSRT, there are quite a few cases in which people didn't stop when they had to stop. We thought that these are exactly cases in which people don't have control over the responding. And we thought that, whereas with regular Stroop trials, we're going to get the regular Stroop effect, with these erroneous responding when they had to stop, but they didn't, we're going to get indications for task conflict. And here are the results. No, okay. So this is the stop signal with the Stroop. And this is how the experiment was run. Eyal Kalantov ran this. So you have a word, you have to respond to the color, ignore the word, and then when there's a tone, you have to not to respond. These are the results. So in the non-stop trials, which are kind of regular Stroop trials, you can see that there's an interference and there's a small facilitation. in the stop trials, that is the trials in which people responded, but were supposed not to respond, you get a reverse facilitation. So this is exactly what we expected before the experiment. Now, predicting stop experiment facilitation, of course, if you believe that stopping, that people really vary in their ability to stop, then you can predict who will be able to stop, to give you a facilitation and who will not. And this is what we did. And again, you can see that this is the facilitation, and you get facilitation for people whose SSRT is short, and no facilitation or reverse facilitation for those that are not able to stop, or actually their SSRT is long, relatively long, an indication for us that these people are less able to control their responding. Similarly, we did something with switching between word and color. And here, again, you have to actually, here there are two tasks. In one case, you are asked to respond to the color and ignore the word. And in one case, you are asked to respond to the word and ignore the color. Okay, so you're switching between color and word. And the CTI, the time between the task, the instruction, color or word, and the stimulus itself was either 0, 300, or 1500 milliseconds. Of course, we thought that in the 0 and the 300, possibly, people are less able to control or switch and control their tasks. And in the 1500, they will be able to do it, or relatively at least. So we expected a reverse facilitation here and not here. And this is what happened. We found the reverse facilitation in the short CTI and not in the long CTI. Now, we switch a little bit to pupillometry. So in 1966, Kahneman and Beatty suggested to use pupil dilation as a way to measure what they called mental effort. And we recently started using it. Apparently, it has been used in quite a few labs around the world recently. And we ran a stoop task and looked at the pupil changes. So here is how the tasks work. You have a regular stoop task. The only difference actually is that we fix the time of the word, because otherwise if you leave the word to stay until responding, then you're going to get differences in the exposure time of the stimuli for incongruent and congruent or neutral, and this might affect pupil dilation. It's not very important in reaction time experiments, but here it could be very important. So the task is respond to the color and ignore the meaning of the word, and we measure reaction time and changes in pupil dilation. So this is what we get. This is the incongruent condition. This is the congruent condition. Okay, so what you have here is relative pupil size. So we look at 200 milliseconds before the stimulus, and before the onset of the stimulus, and then compute for every sample this changes in pupil dilation. So you have incongruent, congruent, and neutral. And these are Bayesian differences differences between the various conditions. I'm not going to go over it, but you can see that there are 2 points to look at that are kind of interesting. One is, sorry. So we have information conflict. This is the incongruent minus congruent, and we have the task conflict. This is the congruent minus the neutral. The information conflict appears relatively early. Take a look here. So the difference between green congruent and the red incongruent appears here. This is something like 700 milliseconds, 800 milliseconds after the stimulus onset. In contrast, the task conflict appears relatively early, after close to 500 milliseconds. Now take a look here. This here, there's no difference between the green and the red line. There's no congruency effect at all here. But there's a clear task conflict. There's a clear difference between these two lines and the neutral. Okay, so this is the task conflict, and as Liad Goldfarb suggested at the time, the task conflict appear. Why don't we see it? Because it appears very early, and this is something that in order to execute the task that we have to execute, we need to suppress this very early on, and this is why, according to what our results to Liat's ideas, we usually don't see it. So this is the experiment, and we can summarize that goal-directed behavior involves execution of the appropriate task, focusing on the appropriate information. Context suggests various tasks and affords various responses, and we have, of course, to ignore them. The troop task, this is our message, involves both task and information conflict, and the task conflict appears very early on. I'm going to skip this. And now task conflict may be involved in many other situations, and I'm going to discuss this later. Hopefully I'm going to get to it. Okay, now just a few comments on mechanisms and neutrals. So the neutral that we used was a series of X's. If you use word as a neutral, like lion, that many people do use, you don't get the task conflict. You don't get reverse facilitation, whatever you do, and you don't get it in pupil dilation studies also, because words create task conflict, okay? So this is what I just said. And here's an example for a recent example for, again, pupil dilation study. So what we did here was to have congruent and incongruent, and also this was one neutral. Another neutral was something that kind of abstract nonsense stimuli that we took from Vidal Lahey's study on object interference that I kind of rushed through. And the last thing is the, is the color patches. We just went back to Stoop experiment and we used color patches. And you can see that the task conflict appears here, okay? But it is larger and more pronounced for the color patches than for the series of letters, which suggests that even letters that don't have meaning may produce some task conflict. Last, on this, many or quite a few researchers suggest look at the Stroop effect by looking at differences between the incongruent and the congruent. The problem here is that this looks only at a combination of difficulties, and it doesn't look at the task conflict. So in cases that actually the task conflict is the major conflict, you may not see any difference. So this is a paper that by a study ran by Eyal Kalantrop that looked at what happens to the Stroop effect when you add memory load to it. And it turns out that the difference between the congruent and incongruent doesn't change. That is, memory load doesn't change the difference between congruent and incongruent. What quite a few people suggest is the Stroop effect, but it does change the task conflict. So you do get a change relative to the neutral, but you don't get a change for the difference between congruent and incongruent, and this might happen. Now, several words on implications. So I think that the results discussed so far have important implications in other areas of social science. One such area is information security behavior, and another is use of social media. Now, I recently read several papers on addictive behavior and implicit associations, especially with respect to social media. And it has been suggested that the formation of implicit associations underlie addictive behavior. Repetition of behaviors form trigger behavior reward association, and these associations are retrieved upon exposure to external, like seeing something, or internal cues. This should remind us of the affordances that I suggested or talked about or mentioned in an earlier slide right after I presented Lermit's the environmental dependency syndrome. Okay, so specific cues then after lead to automatic and habitual responses that complete with various goals and intentions. And researchers suggested that implicit association underlies substance use, addictive use of videogram, smartphones, and so on and so forth. And recently it has been suggested that implicit association are related to excessive use of social media. So this is something that we thought that we're going to, in collaboration with the Field 2L, try to run hopefully soon. So we're going to use kind of a Facebook, for Facebook users. Apparently there are people who really use Facebook heavily and really like this social media apparatus. And we thought of trying to find whether we can create a Stroop-like Facebook task. And here you have to, you're going to see an emoji and a Facebook sign. I mean, it could be something else. And you have to respond to the emoji and ignore the Facebook sign. And so for those who really like Facebook, this will be congruent, this will be a neutral, this will be the incongruent. Here's another incongruent. We think that we are going to be able to find differences in this effect between those that really heavily use Facebook and those that do not. And my prediction is that we're going to find mainly task conflict, and the information conflict will be, there will be less of a difference between the two groups of users for the information conflict. Now, an important characteristic of the discussed addictive behavior features competition between habitual task and long-term goal of the user. And accordingly, okay, actually I said it before. Now, with respect to internet security, again, this is these are the cases in which people open unsafe emails, attachment, and so on. And interestingly, apparently, there are certain contexts that affect this behavior. This is by Turel and others, like poor sleep quality and online ostracism, being socially excluded, affect the likelihood of opening unsafe messages. And we think that work in this area of groups coming from people in cognitive psychology working on conflict and people in business administration could lead to some important and interesting ventures that will help understand the mechanisms that are related to addiction and to various media and others and so on. Now, before I finish, I would like to just conclude by several comments. One is that cognitive control aims to enable organism to pursue its goal. It involves inhibitory as well as facilitatory processes. We suggest that there are two major conflicts, task and information, that underlie the STOOP task and possibly quite a few similar tasks. We suggest that the distinction between task conflict and information conflict might have important implications for various areas of study, like what I just suggest for business administration. And last, I wanted to finish by posing a question that is not very important scientifically, but I thought that might be interesting after all. And this is the question: would Stroop himself embrace our conclusions or what I suggested? So this is John Ridley Stroop, and I would suggest that the answer to this question is positive, actually. Stroop himself discussed task conflict in his original paper. This is a citation from his paper. And basically, I'm not going to read the whole citation, but basically what he said was that the problem is that words are really highly associated with reading, whereas colors are associated with many things. So the word reading is much more automatically activated, and this is what creates the major problem. It is not the information necessarily that differ, of course, between the two aspects of the stimulus, but the reading itself. So now, he, after all, so Stroop, in my opinion, was actually interested in task conflict, but he couldn't measure it because he couldn't have congruent trials. Remember, this is what Stroop used. He used only these two conditions. He couldn't use the congruent trial. So he basically was looking for the penny under the light. And this is why we were stuck with this interference, and we didn't look much for the facilitation, and thought that facilitation is a something that needs to be small and uncontrolled. So he had to Stroop had to settle for the interference effect when he couldn't use congruent trials. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Avishai, for a fascinating talk. Thank you for the audience too. If we have any questions, please raise your hand, and I'll call you. So Danny, do you want to ask? Can you unmute yourself? Here, I'm asking you to unmute.
Yes.
Good.
Avishai, first of all, a very, very, very interesting and well-given lecture. It was really amazing. I have a question. So actually, what you call task or the control problem is that you are presenting a instruction, say the word, say the color, and then you change the situation. So the conflict of congruency is created following the instructions, following the presentation after you are giving the instruction. I don't know if anything was done like that, or if you think about that, what would happen if you reverse the situation? Which means you present the stimulus, all the stimulus, and then you ask the question after it was presented. So you have to backward forward. So you present the situation, and then you come say, word was the word, what was the color? So control comes after and not before exposure. I don't know if anyone has done that or what would be.
Okay, it's a good idea. I don't remember anyone who ran this exact study that you suggested. The closest is our task switching, because it has, I think Eyal's task switching that I presented has in general your idea. That is to try and reduce control by making people have the two tasks in their mind all the time. But what you're suggesting is, well, what happens if you're going to make people hold the two tasks in their mind all the time, even after seeing the stimulus, because they don't know what they will be asked to do.
Yes.
And in this case, I would predict that you're going to get even larger task conflict.
Well, the question is, basically you reverse the control condition.
Right.
In your definition, there is no control requirement in this task, but a retrieval of what you have spontaneously processed. The question if the same trends that you observed in the order that you have observed would be retained or not. I think it's a key question for the question of the control. Who is controlling what?
But you still have to introduce control when you see what you have to do. That is, you saw the stimulus, now you're waiting short or long time until you have to, you get the instruction what to do. Now, of course, if the instruction will come 2 minutes later, then you have all the two answers and there will be no difference. If it comes right after the stimulus offset, then my belief is that I think that what we're going to see is something similar to Eyal Kalantrov's task switching with the very short CTIs. Yeah, you're right. I mean, it's
I
an
think it
empirical
would be
question.
interesting, an interesting pointing out the interrelation between the two processes.
Okay.
Thank you. And Emma, do you want to ask?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks, Avishai. Great talk and great work. I was wondering, you mentioned that there were a series of letters that still created some conflict. And I was wondering, because there might be an effect of the actual phonemes that the letters represent and the interaction between this and the phonemes in the letter in the colored names, were there differences between letters that were part of the color name, of a color name, and letters that are not?
Right. So first of all, yes, you're right. I mean, you actually predicted the results. I mean, but there are quite a few papers not related to task conflict at all on Stroop and various changes in the letters, the phonemes, and so first letter have a major effect.
Yeah.
Even if you have, instead of red, you have the word, something with the word R as the first letter, you get interference and it is larger than if the second letter only resembles the E in the red, and so on and so forth. Phonology is important, and it affects performance. Yossi Tselgov had beautiful research on pseudo-homophones. So he took Kachol in English. So it's not a word in English, and only Hebrew readers can, listen and hear that, and this creates an interference. We didn't do it with the task conflict. So we don't know what will happen with this. I expect this very similar result, but basically this is a relative, I think it's 20 years ago or something.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? So I have a question, Avishai. In your Facebook experiment, I'm asking myself whether
Which we haven't been done yet.
Yes, okay. So it's a good time to ask a question, right? I'm asking myself whether there's really a task conflict there. Because when you have a color and a word, these are clearly two different tasks, right? To read the word and to extract the color.
Right.
But when you have two icons, aren't you doing very similar tasks? You're like reading the icons, right? Or you're extracting the meaning of the icons. Is this really two different tasks that you're having a conflict between them?
Yeah. Well,
and also, one more thing, and also the fact that you spatially separated them, right? Whereas in the Stroop there were one object.
Right. But
presumably there's a spatial shift of attention, right?
Yeah, but I think that this is basically similar. Look, I'm not really an expert on social media. This is something that I just recently went into, and the literature on social media and addiction says that actually there are two tasks, and that there is a conflict. This is the way that they describe it, without even unknowingly about our work on or other work on the task conflict. The way it is described is that there's a long-term intentions or long-term goals of a person and short-term goals. The reward that you get from a cigarette, the reward that you get from looking at the Facebook, and so on. And they really describe it as a reward. And you always have the tendency to respond to the Facebook or pay attention to the Facebook, for example, as a social media platform, and do this even when you know that you have to do something else at the same time. So this is why I thought that this is going to create mainly a task conflict, not necessarily. Now the person I'm talking with.
So that would be parallel to. So that would be probably parallel to just, let's say, any stimulus that has a very high value.
Right.
For any one of us, right?
Yes. This is why I think that this thinking mechanisms and so on have implications for in other fields, and there are certain things that we can do, or we can interdisciplinary work could help examine that otherwise is not so clear.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks a lot. Anybody wants to ask any other question? Okay, so I'd like to thank Professor Avishai Henik. Thank you very much. Someone else? Yes, Small, please unmute yourself.
Hi, yeah.
Last question, yeah.
Hi, Avishai. Thank you for the interesting talk. I have a question about the reverse facilitation. You talked about it, and you said we would expect a normal facilitation, but we saw a reverse one when we compared the congruent to the neutral trials. And I wanted to ask, to your opinion, what is the explanation to it in regards to, is it an the possibility when a person is looking for the conflict, maybe, or the expectation for a conflict that makes the times.
No, it's okay. This is how we think about it. Usually, if you think about the conflict and you try to really ignore the information, then one thing that you have to do is, okay, think about it this way. You have a word in a color. You have to pay attention to the color and ignore the word. In order to do this, you need to really try to shut off the word, to shut activation of the word. If the word didn't activate anything in our lexicon, you're not going to get a stop effect at all. This is what would happen if I read Chinese. If I have Chinese color words, I wouldn't, you're not going to find for me a stop effect. So if you shut the activation, then there's no problem. However, you cannot shut the activation. And this is why you get the two pieces of information. But our pupil dilation studies show that this information, this difference in information, this incongruency between the two pieces of information come in relatively late. And there is a point in time, like 300, 400 milliseconds, that you could actually shut the word and not get at all this difference in information. This is where you are trying to deal with the task conflict. This is even before the information conflict. I think that this is the story. So for quite a few years, we had a difficulty because in order to get the reverse facilitation, as I described in Liad Goldford's work, you really had to do many things to try to have lots of neutrals in order to create this reverse facilitation. With the pupil dilation, you have third neutral, third congruent, third incongruent, third neutral, exactly the same proportion of neutrals, but you do get the reverse facilitation very early on. So I think that the pupil dilation tells us the story, a clearer story, and an interesting one, I think.
Yeah, really interesting one. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Avishai. Thanks again from everybody.
Thanks.
I would like to take 30 seconds and just mention that our next meeting is in the Gather platform for the poster session, the first poster session. For those of you who have already tried the Gather or been to one of our meetings, instruction meetings, then you know how to enter. For those who haven't, you can go to the website of the conference. There's a specific link to the Gather. And there is also a tutorial there, a short tutorial, a short demo that you can watch for 7 or 8 minutes that will tell you about the Gather platform. It's pretty simple. And there's also going to be 2 information desks right when you enter this virtual world. And they're going to be help people there. We're going to stand there. Just as you see us here, you're going to see us there, and you can ask us questions and we'll assist you. So again, you can, for those who haven't tried the Gather yet, you can go to the conference website, the ISCOP 2021. On the Google, you'll find the website, then just enter. There is a specific Gilayon for the Gather, and you have all the links and all the demos there. You can try it, and we'll meet at 3, which is in about half an hour. And there is help desk, and you can ask us any questions. You can mail us. We're going to be online. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate. If you have a problem with your poster, please email us and we'll try to assist you online, or just once you're inside the Gather, chat with us in the Gather. There's also a chat icon in the Gather. You can find us, and just like in the Zoom, you can find us and ask us questions, and we'll assist you. And there's Lishai and Maya who constructed this Gather world. I want to thank them from here. And see you there. And right after the poster session, I think 5:30, 3 to 5 is the poster session, if I remember correctly. 5:30 is our keynote by Nora Newcomb. Please come. And then later on in the evening, the social evening, please. I'm also calling the PIs, the professors, to join us in this social evening, which is going to be a lot of fun. And the students have put a lot of work on this evening, so I'm sure it's going to be a lot of fun. So we'll see you there. So Avishai, thanks again, and see you all later on. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.